Welcome to the Marshall Pruett podcast, presented by Cooper Tires and our My Racing Life and Career series. My guest this time is my pal Mark Raffauf. I could, come up with about 27 different titles he's had at IMSA. This is a great conversation we had at the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship race at Monterey here about a month or two ago, delving into his racing life and career, where he came from, his introduction to the sport, specifically IMSA, that he's been with forever. And boy, talking about someone who was there in the 70s when it was taking off, in the 80s when the GTP series, along with GTO, GTU, and GTP Lights, was just the best thing ever. It was really cool to sit with Mark, learn about his journey, learn about his involvement in the sport, and he was truly, on the technical side, so heavily involved in authoring many of the cars that we loved, the classes that we loved, that made IMSA just such a masterpiece of the 70s and 80s. He has a new book. The book that Mark and Mitch Bishop have co-authored is due out here shortly. It's titled IMSA 1969 through 1989, the inside story of how John Bishop built the world's greatest sports car racing series, is titled specifically to denote the era where John and Peggy Bishop founded and ran IMSA before it was sold. Quality motor racing books like this gorgeous piece of work from Mitch and Mark. This is the kind of thing that, at least for me, we need more of. So buying it, I would strongly recommend it, having read a number of chapters already, and just sitting here waiting patiently to add the full version to my bookshelves. This is for me, just a great time sitting down with Mark. He is responsible for so many great things in IMSA. We get into a number of things, including BOP, which his free, honest opinions of are great to hear. Talk about the well-known, the International Marijuana Smuggling Association, the drug era, where we had a number of drivers who were involved. So Mark shares some thoughts on that, and we're going to hopefully do part 2, part 3, and just get into more of his life and career. He was really the father, one of the primary fathers of the Daytona prototype formula, DPI that we now have today. Just a treasure, genuine treasure of stories and knowledge, and we're going to get into a lot more in future episodes of My Racing Life and Career with him. You know you can get every episode of the Marshall Pruett podcast on iTunes, on Podbean, Google Play, Spotify, through a variety of content aggregators. And if you go ahead and visit and join our Marshall Pruett podcast Facebook page, you will get every episode immediately when I post them. All right, off we go with Mark Raffauf, his amazing IMSA life, in part 1 of his My Racing Life and Career, presented by Cooper Tires.
I had the good fortune of knowing you for a while, Mark, and the through line of your career has that arrow, that IMSA arrow, seemingly from the beginning till today, whether it's through even up through Grand Am, now in the modern iteration of IMSA. There are few people who know where the bodies are buried, and you've been good at keeping most of the secrets there too. We'll get to the fun part, which is a book that you and Mitch Bishop have put together that's coming out, and I can't wait to read that. Before we get to the printed version of this crazy life you've led and helping to tell the true story of the Bishop family and the creation of IMSA, let's talk about the creation of Mark Raffauf. Tell us about where you were born, what kind of household, where did racing come in?
Ooh, okay, I was born in Philadelphia. Grew up there for 10 years and then moved to Boston. Very downtown environment, no car. Family never owned a car. Father was a pharmacologist, research scientist first, and then a college professor in Boston in pharmacy. My mother is Swiss, so she never had a driver's license. So it's kind of an anti-car environment, if you
so
want to think about it.
naturally their son.
However, my older brother and I got into Formula One as Formula One fans actually back in the 60s. And I spent a good portion of my school career in my youth drawing Formula One cars instead of studying. So I have a talent for that, apparently. My doodles in the office are well received.
Your doodles are famous. I drew Formula One cars as well, but they were not. They went into the garbage can.
Okay, some do, some get stayed. But it's funny because my subsequent mentor in later years, John Bishop, is also famous for his doodles.
Yes.
Airplanes, ships, trains, cars, all kinds of his artwork is fabulous. So basically, in the early 70s, my brother went to Georgia Tech and came home one summer with a 66 911 that we proceeded to rebuild the engine in the parking garage below the Prudential Center in downtown Boston, which was entertaining when we took it upstairs to heat the pistons up to get the rings off and stuff like that in a high-rise apartment building. So we did a lot of crazy stuff, and then people started asking us, you want to work on our car? No, we're doing this for ourselves. But so that kind of started, a direction, and he had gone to Road Atlanta when it opened and kind of worked and became an SCCA person. So when he came home in the summer, we went off to the races in New England as SCCA tech inspectors, and I actually was in an era when you could get a letter from your parents that said it was okay. You didn't have to go through all the crap you go through now when you're like 14 or 15 working at the races. So early 70s up through 73, I worked in New England region. I had a national tech license at 14.
How crazy.
Yeah, and then at that time, IMSA had started and was based in New England, in Connecticut, and Charlie Rainville was the executive steward of the Northeast region, and he was at the same time one of the few people that went to support John right away, and they'd known each other from before when John was at the SCCA in the 60s, and that story is well covered in the book. So I knew John, and I knew Peg, and I knew Charlie, and I knew Bob Raymond, who ran the pits and grids for New England region. And through that, that's when Tullius and Sharp were racing C production TR6 versus 240s, and Newman was running the 510, and guys like Kenny Duclos had Formula B Brabham BT40s. So there's a lot of cool stuff in SCCA racing.
Gorgeous age, and in that region as well,
yeah,
a real hotbed.
We had a real hotbed where it all started, really. So I had that kind of upbringing, and then in 74, I went down to Atlanta and was checking out Georgia Tech, thought maybe I'd go to school there, and went, and Charlie had asked me the fall before, and John, hey, if you ever come to any of our races, we'd be happy to have you. Great. So we went to the 6 hours of Road Atlanta that took the place of the 12 hours of Sebring in 74 because of the fuel business at Daytona and Sebring. So that was kind of my first intro, and I got pushed right into it with Howard Daugherty, who was the tech inspector. Charlie said, yeah, this kid can do all this stuff. So my brother had already done it a few times in 73. So I kind of just got absorbed into the process and the family, so to speak, which was quite small. There was about 7 of us, in IMSA in those days, including John and Peg.
So next year, IMSA is celebrating its 50th anniversary. So we're talking about you being a part of the family in year 5.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So I didn't do any of the early formula races. I didn't do the very first GT races at VIR. And in the book, actually, Mitch Bishop, we're almost the same age. In that period of time, we were going to college in different places, but we hung out and palled out and went to the races together all through the 70s. So we've been, we joke about being brothers from different mothers because that was kind of how I got assimilated into the family, so to speak.
But that's amazing, though, because with John and Peggy is, truly a mother and father figure of the series, age-wise, it's just so cool that you and Mitch, their son, have, fell in kind of perfect timing, and here you are all these years later collaborating.
There was 2, the story is in the book, but there were 2 other brothers. One died of cancer, Mark, of all people, named, and the second, Marshall, unfortunately, actually committed suicide later as he had just left working for IMSA. But Mitchell was the youngest, and he took a path away from IMSA as a career. But we've stayed close together and been to a couple of his weddings. I don't know how many he's had, but I've been to
He's a perfectionist.
He practiced a lot, I guess. But anyway, so we're still pals, and that kind of all came back together recently to do the book because we both had the same feelings and desire to capture the process that created this organization and what it did, and primarily John and Peg, because they were the deal. They, as much as Bill France Sr. helped get it started, John was the guy that did it, and there were a lot of people that were there to help him, but his vision and long-term view and success with the organization is quite astounding as a business story, let alone a racing story. And as a product of, the Depression or the late Depression, being in the military in World War II, again in Korea, and then in the airplane design business, and then eventually somehow ending up at the SCCA after going to a race at Watkins Glen. That story in the book is quite fascinating, of just how things happened at certain times that directed John and Peg in a certain way to end up where it went. And I'll leave the rest in the book, okay? But it's a great story. It's a great story about the people and what they did, and I think that's one of the things that Mitch and I really wanted to capture. That's the thing that we're looking forward to, because honestly, as someone who I might have mentioned before in another podcast, I think I have every IMSA book. I think if anyone's printed an IMSA book, for the most part, I got it. We should compare notes. Yeah, I know, because you might. I'm sure you might have a couple, but I pretty much got them all. And there are a lot of amazing ones. There's a couple that are hot garbage, but I can't really think of any that tell the real, not just origins, but the heart coming from the family side. So again, that's something that we're not trying to foreshadow too much. That is something for the book. What I would love to know, one of the things I've been curious about, which maybe this starts a little journey on your path in the mid-'70s and latter '70s. So today, Mark, we come to an IMSA event, multiple transporters here, things are timed and planned where everything is like clockwork. We've got our 3 classes, electronics up the wazoo. It is a finely honed process. Some, like myself, at times say maybe it's a little bit too regimented. As someone who was there, can you contrast what things were like in a, pick the year, 75, 76, at Name the Track with a Peter Gregg and Name the beautiful Porsche model versus Name the beautiful BMW model versus the Monza versus the whatever. Infrastructure, mindset-wise, what was IMSA like, the one that you were contributing to in the mid to late 70s? Is it as structured as this? No, it was not at all. It was John was a benevolent dictator, and he set a tone. The guy that I work for directly, who is sort of the quiet underlying guy that created the term and the philosophy of racing with a difference, was Charlie Rainville. Okay, and he was essentially our competition director. So he was what we would call today the race director, the chief steward. He was the head of the tech. He was looking at everything, and it was loose enough. And the idea was to get people to race, as opposed to some of the other organizations in road racing who seem to build roadblocks to prevent people from racing. So we, as a small group, Howard Doherty, myself, Bob Raymond, my brother, Jim Lynch, a couple other people that work, Harry Haggard, who's still around, who worked in the technical department and under Charlie, ultimately Roger Bailey, in the late 70s, early 80s, and he came from a team, the McLaren BMW team. So the 70s was kind of a nurturing time where you could use the term today, which is often referred to as derogatory, of run what you brung. Mm-hmm. Well, we ran what showed up, and we had... There's
photo evidence of the oddities, but they're beloved oddities.
They were cool stuff, and we dealt with a lot of neat people. We had the first international race was 1,000 kilometers in Mexico City. So we invited all the Mexicans to come up to Daytona next year, and some odd contraptions came. Actually, Rabake, Freddie Van Buren won this 1,000K race. In an RSR Carrera, they beat Greg, they beat Haywood, they beat Mike Kaiser, they beat Greenwood, they beat all our regular guys who went. So they could do the job, and they had the same car everybody else did. But the 70s was, first it was kind of run what you brung. We ran RS cars on slicks, which were our little sedan series of baby grands. They'd run, so you'd have Pintos and MGBs out there running with Greenwood Corvettes and bigger Greenwood Corvettes and Carreras and CSLs, and Harry Theodorkopoulos had one of the big Capri 3600 Group 2 cars, which was a wonderful monster-sounding V6, Cosworth heads, beautiful car. So there was a lot of diversity. We had Panteras. We had even an Alfa Romeo Montreal GT4 car, Group 4 car. So we had all kinds of stuff, and everybody was kind of feeling out this new kind of racing, which was really a blend of European GT cars and old Trans Am cars. So we had, Giacomo with his Javelins and Warren Agor with his Camaro. So we had a lot of disgruntled Trans Am guys who really didn't like to run in the early 70s against, the factory deals. So all that combined led for quite a menagerie of hardware. Carl Schaefer's big Camaro, the big Orange Beast. I mean, John Greenwood with the Corvettes. We had some really cool, exciting cars. And a lot of times they were a little funny at times. Roof got chopped here, wheelbase got stretched there, whale tail was a little too big. And, Charlie had a way of making them right, and the result was really good competition. We had a GT division and like a GTU division for little cars. And then the 240s came with Sharp and Frizzell. And so that era was kind of an opportunity for people, particularly the import manufacturers, for the first time to showcase their product, which people today don't realize was really kind of new. I mean, a BMW 2002 was kind of like, what the hell is that?
Sure.
The TII was, well, that's cool. And then there was the Z car. And then subsequent cars, 914-6, 911s, of course. But it Ford Escort, the Cosworth 2-liter Ford Escorts. Newman had one of those. A guy named Juan Montalvo in Miami had one. So and John Buffum had one. Rally guy. People don't know his name, but one of the great American race car guys. So we had all these cool cars, and we managed by Charlie's expertise of being a car guy, and his story is a whole nother story, to put them in groups that race together well, and to be honest, everybody had a really good time. In the process of doing the book, we tried to find people who wanted to say or had reasons to say something negative, and we couldn't find anybody, really. I mean, we looked, is there anything bad that you didn't like about it? But you got an apple when you got the registration. Everybody was promoting people to do something that they like to do, and I think that's the prevailing attitude of the 70s. As it got later in the 70s and the turbo era came along and the big Decon Monzas, Holbert, Greg, I mean, these guys were great racers. And it's funny because in the controversy of today about rating drivers, all those guys had real jobs elsewhere.
Yeah.
Peter Gregg sold cars. Al Holbert sold cars. John Greenwood made Corvette parts for GM.
Al Holbert, fake silver.
Well, you joke about it, but it's funny.
But it could...
a lot of the great names of the 70s. Hurley Haywood never went to a driver's school, never had a coach, never had any of that. He went to a couple solos, I think, and beat Peter.
Yeah.
And Peter said, hey, you can drive with me. He got an SCCA license, and I think in his book, and then he got shipped to Vietnam. When he came back, Peter Gregg went to Charlie Rainville and said, I want this guy to drive with me. And Charlie said, okay, gave him a license. There was no school or test. And so you look at the talent that came out of that kind of environment in IMSA. I don't want to say it was easy to get a license, but there was more emphasis on could you think while you're driving? It wasn't how fast you were, it was how smart you would be. So a lot of names in IMSA. Joe Vardy was a drag racer. Never did anything in road racing whatsoever until he came to IMSA in a Gremlin with a doctor from Tampa. And the doctor from Tampa said to Charlie, hey, this kid's pretty good. Gave him a license. He did fine, obviously. So there's a whole bunch of people who came out of IMSA who never really had any, quote, formal training, but the environment allowed them to go and show what they could do, and if they could do it, they were welcome.
It seems like trust might have been the core thing.
For sure. Both ways. I mean, I think the participants trusted the organization to do the right thing, which it did, and though there would always be some disagreements at times, when all was said and done, I'd have to rate Charlie Rainville as an official as probably the fairest man I've ever known. And that's the one thing I tried to learn from him was you can be not looked upon nicely by certain people at certain times, but in time, when you know you've succeeded, they'll come back to you and say, I don't necessarily agree with you, but you were fair. And if you get that kind of response a year later, even after you really pissed somebody off, you're doing a good job. Because Charlie was gruff, tough, didn't take any crap from anybody, and nobody could rarely pull one over on him. He was a very brilliant guy. But that being said, so the 70s then led into the 935 era and higher technology, greater speed.
So where are you at career arc-wise? Because obviously a young kid in tech is great, but then your name... and I have some of the old rule books, your name starts popping up, so obviously you're moving and shaking within the organization too.
So when I graduated from high school, I ended up going to University of Florida, and the reasons were primarily I was a swimmer. though I wasn't of the Olympic level that they were at. Gainesville there was 3 races in Daytona, Sebring, 1 at Talladega, and 2 at Atlanta. So half the calendar was.
I love the fact that your collegiate decision was based on
racetrack proximity. And you could get, and then in the summer, I would go. Phil Curran was from Gainesville.
Yeah.
So I'd ride to Mid-America and Mid-Ohio and the other places. And then while I was in school, John would call me up and he says, "Hey, you want to go to Riverside? You want to go to Laguna?" "Yeah, sure." So here I was, typical poor college student in Florida, and I'd get tickets in the mail to go to California to go to a race. And I was like, "Oh, how cool is that?" So off we go, right? So I did that, and I graduated 78. And in 78, John had said, when you're done with school, you have a job. So I got almost done, and I went up there for a summer and was like full-time.
Was there any thought in your mind about pursuing anything else after
Well,
college?
I actually have a degree in photography and painting. I have a fine arts degree, a BFA. Yeah.
What?
So hence the doodling. Yeah,
Wow.
So it's not even close to...
the layers to Mark Raffauf we didn't even know about.
Exactly. So, and the reason for that was when it was time to go to school, I could have gone to the Rhode Island School of Design, which is a very prestigious, I won't say art school, but a design school. And I actually made the decision, and my parents were okay with making the decision to go to Gainesville. Initially to swim, because I was pretty good, but not. They had 8 Olympic medalists. I wasn't ready for that, and too many good co-eds and all that other stuff to distract you. And half the IMSA calendar.
Racing.
Yeah, exactly. So that being said, I ended up going through that and actually going back to a creative fine arts degree, liberal arts degree, but a BFA. And then sort of with a year to go, kind of set my sights on it. Well, if I got a job already, how often when you're a junior does somebody say, when you're done, but you got to finish, which John said, you could come work for us. So all through that period, I'd go to 90% of the races. Occasionally there'd be one scheduled at a time I just couldn't go because of school stuff. So I did have some level of responsibility to that. But so it was great. So I get to go to all these tracks that we still go to today when they were in a completely different state of physical condition. I mean, you could look at the photos from the 70s of where we raced. Even at places like Riverside, we were running 200-mile-an-hour plus cars, and Riverside was just a piece of ribbon of asphalt through the desert. There were barriers, there were hills everywhere. There was all kinds of places things could go wrong, which occasionally they did. So that 70s period up into the 1935 era in the late 70s, early 80s, before the creation of GTP, I got much more involved with the operational part of it as well. Charlie knew me from the early 70s. He knew I understand how the logistics of an event operate. So I kind of became the guy on the ground for the guy in the tower. So I was the deliverer of the message, good or bad. I mean, the funny story here was that Charlie we used to work off the bridge. The bridge, there was no tower here. He worked off the starter's bridge. Charlie would call me up because John Paul Sr. had threatened to kill another Scramp person. He said, "Mark, go down there and talk to John. You just can't kill anybody, I know he's upset." So I had the task of going to guys like that and bringing him back down and say, "You know what, you got better things to worry about than that guy that's pissing you off because of where you park."
We have a strict no murder policy in IMSA, by the way.
If you're going to kill somebody, make it off campus. Don't do it here, okay? So
that's a stop and hold plus 5 minutes for that one.
We had a pretty interesting group of people. You still had what I would consider the consummate professionals, which were Brumos, Peter Gregg, Early Haywood, and clearly once you got past the 934 stage into the 935 was the guy to beat. But you had Interscope with Ungaius and Field. You had Bob Aiken came. You had Charlie Mendez. You had the Whittingtons. You had the Pauls, and regardless of their reputation elsewhere, every one of those guys were consummately great racers.
Yes.
Bruce Levin.
Yes.
I mean, they all came in at that time and became the prominent 80s car owners, except for Peter, who had his issue, Al, who was for a while and unfortunately passed away unexpectedly. So that late 80s drew in these guys who then became the team owners of the GTP era. And that was kind of an interesting thing that IMSA was able to do. As people came in, they didn't go away in 2 years. They stayed and made a career.
That's a great point.
Racing or doing something that they love to do. So the best line in the book is probably Pete Halsmer's, who said, "John and Peg Bishop created IMSA, which is a place people like me could make a living doing something I loved." And, when you look down the list and you look at the Joe Vardys and the Roger Mandevilles and the Amos Johnsons, they started racing, little shit boxes.
Yeah.
Okay. And ended up making Jim Downing. Companies and
Factory
teams. They went from nothing all the way through the full range of the sport, which IMSA consciously did. There was an entry level. There was a pyramid there that created technological talent, engineering talent, crew talent, driver talent, business talent, everything. And that was a strong thing through the whole time frame up until the 90s, probably, where the game kind of changed for other reasons. So the book clearly talks about that. And, there were many milestones along the way with great cars, great drivers. The Redmonds, the Hobbs, and the Europeans, the Fitzpatricks, started coming and racing because they realized they, too, all of a sudden, could make a living driving race cars in the United States. And I'd be remiss if I didn't bring in the importance of the Camel brand and R.J. Reynolds and the sponsorship that we had from 73 on, really, and how that evolved as well as a partnership of, at one time, the longest running one in racing. And
what they did to elevate and activate IMSA, I mean, maybe Winston possibly on the Cup side in terms of in that same sphere of influence, but if you look back in any magazine, any print material, anything, there is some sort of Camel imprint of money being spent. Obviously, they're trying to promote their tobacco products, but they're using the series the way you would hope any primary sponsor would do, which is we're all in. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the back page of a magazine, whether it's the giveaway, you name it, a huge presence at every track, whether it's big blow up, this, that, and the other.
Camel tent, fan experience.
Again, we're in hindsight, obviously, we ask ourselves, how exactly did we let tobacco take over all of motor racing? Regardless, looking back on what it was, without Camel, IMSA would be a little niche thing that was cool, but never really broke out.
It broke out. And it's the same with the other brands, whether it was Philip Morris and IndyCar, or whether it was Winston with drag racing and stock car racing. But Camel actually did Camel Pro, which was road racing bikes, and Camel GT, because they felt that was the international brand.
Yeah.
And this reflected the international flavor of the sports, bikes and cars. So, I just wanted to bring that up and say that, through that whole era, their activation and understanding of what they could do with it grew every year. Now, there was a period where they had some management changes, and we went to Winston one year. It was the Winston GT one year, and then it went to nothing. And then they came back with another management change when they realized it was really stupid. And it wasn't directed at IMSA. It was directed at sports marketing as a whole, where the only thing that survived that era really was NASCAR. They kept the Winston Cup. But they came back in 81, I think it was 79 and 80, where there was that little kind of dry period. And it was funny because when Robbie Powell kind of delivered the message to us right before the breakfast, before the promoters meeting after the Road America race in 80, I think it was, everybody was like, oh, God, what are we going to do? And it was the promoters of the events who stepped up and actually posted enough money on a race-by-race basis to exceed Camel's awards to the competitors, the point funds and stuff like that. And that was kind of a pleasing point in time. That was one of those milestones where everybody all of a sudden realized, hey, this is pretty good when the people who take the risk are willing to put their dollars up to make it grow further and actually come up with numbers bigger than what we had. So we were kind of like, whoa. And these were some tough guys. You had Jack Williams and Lee Moselle and guys, Les Griebling, these were the hardcore old-style road racing promoters. And they were the first ones to step to the plate and support the deal with nobody. And it grew again in spite of no Camel because their presence up to that point had driven it to standard dates. Everybody knew when we were going to be at Ohio. Everybody knew we were going to be at Road America. Everybody knew when we were at Atlanta, Daytona. So we, Riverside, Laguna, Sears, Portland, we had good event sponsors, and it just rolled right along. And a year later, Camel came back, and we were very not only gracious, but through that period of time, we were very cognizant of never, ever forgetting what they did to that point.
Sure.
So when they came back, it was open arms from everybody, so they had a bigger reason to step up the game some more. And then the 80s happened, and that was where the meat and the hamburger, in my opinion, happened. So my story just goes, as I got there full time, really, in 78, I went from handling all the contingent awards, working with Charlie on the tech stuff, when Roger got there, working with him, and creating rules. I mean, we literally, even though John would have visions, he would come up with stuff, but the expertise at IMSA was the ability for people there to see a product at the end, and unlike today, work back from what you wanted and create the regulation that would create what it is you wanted, because you knew what you wanted. Nowadays, having been involved in the creation of some modern cars recently, the process worldwide is the exact opposite. It's layer upon layer upon layer, which becomes complex. But you can get an IMSA rule book from that period, and it's literally, what is that?
Quarter inch, half inch
thick.
at most.
It had the sporting regs and the technical regulations for everything we did in a quarter of inch thick book that was small enough to put in your back pocket. That had a ruler on the edge, so you could actually walk down the grid and measure spoilers and ride heights with the rule book.
That's a great
so
point.
We did little stuff like that was kind of cool. I was like, oh yeah, I can measure how my ride height is right here on the grid.
Now you'd burn down a ream of paper, getting halfway there.
And then, they were throwaways, right? And during the events, we'd all write our notes in. So the next year, when we got down to it again, there was continuity, continual continuity. So, but it was simple, it was direct, it was straightforward. The box was not so hard to find when you referred to earlier of the regulatory aspect of it. There was a box, but the box stimulated creativity and stimulated innovation. It wasn't, if it doesn't say you can, you can't. It said, you got to do this. You can't do that. Other than that, have a good time, you know, and it created all kinds of cool stuff that we take for granted today, but a lot of it was innovated and created for the first time 35, 40 years ago. Because the rules didn't say you couldn't, so people played the game, and that was what created the competition. One thing you mentioned, they were playing you're talking about the tracks and everything and the promoters, but they were playing at Marion's this morning at breakfast, the 87 race here that Klaus Ludwig won in the Bayside car.
Yep.
And I was sitting with a whole bunch of people who went, holy crap, is that here?
Yeah.
Because the crowd, the hills, were just covered with people.
I was here.
It was packed. Okay, the hill there, the hill down here. It was the old course without the infield, so the entire hill going up to the top. There was just people everywhere. And that's kind of, when you look back, you realize, wow, because going to a race back then was a big deal. There wasn't a whole lot of TV. People ask me now when we're doing the book, they're going, well, don't you have any digital images? No. It's 800 ASA black and white film. There's so many pieces of silver per space. That's all you get. You can't do much with that. Where's the video? There was no video in the 70s. Anything that was moving was film. So, you've gone through an era of how the sport grew out of where it was because of changes in technology. The very first IMSA race, the very first live ESPN car race was a Kelly race at Lime Rock in 1981.
Wow.
Because they were in Bristol, and Rich Caulfield said, hey, we'd like to try that. Well, sure, come on up. So they took a box van full of crap, went up to Lime Rock, and they shot this race live. And it was like, wow, that was pretty cool. And it wasn't that hard, certainly not at Lime Rock. So that's when that started, was 81. But until then, there was no TV. So when the show came to town, the circus came to town, you had to go to the tent. So you had real promoters who made it worth your while to go to the tent for the customer. And that was also important. And Camel helped them do that. And so it all started to come together as a really good marketing machine, so to speak.
So you come to IMSA full-time in the late 70s, where anyone, whether you were alive or not, if you've looked back on the history of IMSA, where things started to get particularly fun, and cars started going from, that's definitely production-based, to that's from outer space, cartoonish everything. And I say that in the best possible way. It's one of the things I wish we still had. Obscene fenders and curves and things that were so dramatic that you had to see it in person because you couldn't correlate that it was actually based on something you might be able to buy at a dealership. Tell us about, Mark, being a part of that era, this late 70s into the early 80s, where we've got turbo Porsches, we've got the 935s you've mentioned, which go from being factory purchased 935s to, well, here's the JLP2, which we've made on our own, and it's fab car here and this guy there. And I'm guessing from a rules standpoint, we didn't have BOP, but there were rules. Tell us about what it was like in that era where cars start getting crazy. The exponential crazy is exponential awesome. What are you looking at from a regulatory standpoint and trying to sniff out, I don't know if cheaters is the word, or don't go too far out in the grass here because that might be too far? How do you handle that?
Well, the basic premise of all the 70s was a simple formula of power to weight. The heavier your car was, the bigger the engine you could have. And there was a corresponding tire size change. So you got these 454, 494 cubic inch Can-Am engine cross-ram fuel-injected Greenwood Corvettes running 21-inch rear tires and weighing, quite a bit. But they were doing in 74, 212 at Daytona in a Corvette that was the size of a house, okay? So you got to sit there and go, oof, you're already pushing that envelope. But on the racetrack over the course of the season, they were competitive with 330 horsepower, 3-liter air-cooled Porsche Carreras that Porsche spit out by the dozen for $23,000 a piece in 1974. I think one sold at Monterey 2 weeks ago for $1.6 billion. Okay. But that was a very simple, large Volkswagen-type engine in the back of a 911 with a short wheelbase. It wasn't ideal. It was kind of lumpy. And then you had CSLs that were like bricks, just a block with a 3.5-liter straight six. And then you had the Capri with a V6, and then you had Camaros with 427s and other Greenwood Corvettes with small blocks. And by that simple power to weight and a fairly confined how much of the original shell of the car you had to keep, they progressed into the late 70s as 935s of varying types, K3 Kramer, K4 Kramer, the Andile cars, the steel frame cars, the Yost Moby Dick style aluminum cars, the original cars subsequently modified with different forms of bodywork, and there was pretty much a Yost factory style. There was a K3 style, so there were different aero treatments for the same car. But the rules allowed that. The fenders were free. You had to keep the doors and the roof and the center section because essentially worldwide that had become a silhouette class.
Yeah.
So Ford had the Mustangs, which were really the Zach Speed Capris with Ford clips on them, but same principle, small motor, a lot of power. BMW had the 320i, still a brick, but they all won, and they were all competitive enough to participate for the years or the season. Greenwood's last Corvettes were quite huge. John Paul's last one was a massive, beautiful piece of car. But ultimately, there became a function of what's the most cost-effective way to achieve the level that everybody's at. Well, it turned out to be a Porsche 935, and by 1980, everybody had a Porsche 935 of some kind. There was a lot of variety, and different guys won, and all the team owners at some point or another, Aiken won, Bayside won, Charlie Mendez won, the Whittingtons won, Interscope won, everybody won, Dick Barber won, everybody, Fitzpatrick won, everybody was a winner because they were kind of all in that same box with their own personal interpretation of it. So that then spawned, okay, what do we create to combat the fact that everybody's got the same car now? Ford stayed in it, BMW stayed in it, but they were always 1 or 2 against 12 or 15, So the numbers eventually don't play. You'll get 2 or 3 wins a year maybe, but you're not going to win the championship because you can't run their type of car at Daytona and Sebring. I'll also have to say back then, half the races were 500 miles or 6 hours. So the endurance racing was the game. That spawned what eventually became GTP, which was a more cost-effective real race car that worked like a race car, that could be built and campaigned for less. To be quite honest, the 935 was the car, but anybody that drove one would tell you it was pretty much a pig.
Yeah.
And it was 800 horsepower.
It was a straight line star.
It was a missile, you know.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the game became driving it on the boost knob until we took that away. But they would, at Mid-Ohio, guys like Ludwig and Fitzpatrick, they changed the boost level 25 times a lap. Up, down, up, down. You're turning it down to get it on when you're coming out of the corner. So there's a lot of innovation in how you use the equipment, you know, the dry ice in the intercooler to qualify. None of that was prohibited. So people just did it. And we're like, oh, that's cool. They just filled up the intake full of dry ice. What did that do? And the fact that they spit flames out the back like 5 feet.
I mean...
And the noise they made, because they had mechanical wastegates. So when the wastegate opened, you'd hear that whistling sound. So they were very kind of sensory assaulting cars, whether they spit flames out the side or out the back. They all had distinct sounds, and they just were really cool.
I've just told folks that era specifically, late 70s in through the 80s with GTP, if it didn't trigger your fight or flight responses, you were dead.
Exactly.
But that was the thing. And again, I'm not trying to do this. Everything back in the day was better than it is today. That's not the heart of what I'm saying at all. But there were some differences in mindsets and regulation application that allowed everything you mentioned. And it's heartening to hear, and I mean, I knew this, but it's heartening to hear that there's recognition within IMSA, you know, during this era that the flame spitting and the sound and all of these things, it's not just how close can the competition be, but if I was standing at the fence, what are the things would have my mouth wide open? And you go, amazing sounds, amazing looks. If you're spitting fire, you're laying down rubber. I mean, this is something where you just go, this is legal?
Yeah.
How is this legal? This is too crazy.
So you talk back to that philosophy, that was one of the driving things, was this had to be spectacular. And John Bishop had a saying is if the cars are faster than the track, you're going to see something amazing.
Ooh.
Because the drivers are going to have to do heroic things. When you put Formula Fords on Daytona, like 50 of them, and the track is more powerful than the car.
Most boring thing ever.
It's boring. So the cars had to, maybe it's not politically good, they had to exceed, they had to be more than what the racetrack was, so that the guys driving it had to do their business and do it well. And then you saw amazing competition between the guys that did in cars that were just fantastic to watch. Watching one of them by themselves was pretty exciting. Watching 25 of them was like, oh, crap, this is really cool. And that carried on into GTP, where they became even more spectacular because they did all the same things. They spit flames. They did all that stuff. They all had unique sounds, and they were faster still. So when you watched later in the 80s, the best guys driving around like Laguna Seca and hitting 200 going up the hill on this track, you go, man, those guys know what they're doing. And that part, or you watched how, you know, of course, with ground effects and all the things that evolved in the 80s, they were probably as spectacular a car as ever existed when you look at all the elements that were embodied. And they were just fantastic to watch by themselves.
Let's start to wind down on your interaction with GTP and its growth. So we have, in the early 80s, we have what I always refer to as the British kit car solution, and that's really what I think most folks would consider the first GTP cars that they saw. Then we have IMSA famously saying, hey, that Porsche 956 you make is lovely, but we're going to want to protect our drivers' feet. Why don't you come up with something a little different, which was the modified version known as the 962. But there are BMW M1, I always forget all the different early model designations, but a March BMW. Then we start getting into all kinds of great stuff. Nissan wants to get in. We've got Rick Hendrick and Corvettes. We've got Group 44, and we can start mentioning all the customers on the Porsche side, but Toyota comes in eventually. Nissan becomes not just, hey, look, it was fast and blew up, but holy cow, we've got tire wars. We've got, and again, I haven't mentioned Buicks and this and that. Tell us about that era, Mark, from your perspective, knowing how you could have tried to put more of a clamp on things because we started getting a lot of like crazy numbers of manufacturers now are wanting to play.
Yeah.
Some might lean towards, we're going to pull you back, but it seemed like for so long it was a case of no, let this thing grow. Go. Is that what the sensation from inside?
Yeah, I mean every segue of types of cars, another underlying theme was to give the little guy a chance. But the definition of the little guy changed over the decades. So when GTP started, it was the kit car. It was the March, the Lola. Various manufacturers used those cars. You know, the first Nissans were Lolas. The Corvette was a Lola. The RC Buicks were Marches. The BMWs were always Marches. So they went, as we do today, to a constructor to build them a chassis to which they could then pour their engines into and see how fast they could get them to go. So those cars evolved with good engineering here and support from the constructors originally. But, you know, an RC Buick March isn't a whole lot different from a Blue Thunder March underneath.
Yeah.
I mean, it just this. The 962, the three big differences that we couldn't really accept at the time. You mentioned the driver location. The second thing was it did not have a production engine, and GTP started as a stock block exclusive category. It didn't change from that until well into the late 80s with the water-cooled heads. But the original 956s were water-cooled based engines, not air-cooled engines. And the third was they didn't carry enough fuel because the Group C formula was a fuel-driven formula. The car's capacity wasn't enough. We needed 31 gallons, and there was a 20, 25-liter short capacity-wise. So they had to rebuild the whole car anyway. So they finally got it after a year and some unfortunate incidents with the 56 that I don't want to say proved our point, but we weren't engineers, but we just figured if the guy's feet wasn't sticking out past the front wheel somewhere, he's probably a little bit better off. And that was also the era where in IndyCar, guys were smacking the wall pretty regularly with that, and in Formula One. And
Indy Shuffle, it was called.
You know, so we just looked around and went, you know what, we're not rocket scientists, but this doesn't look right. That's a typical John Bishop view of things. Doesn't look right. We're not doing that. So the 962 came along and was really the first true, I mean, it was the front-engine Ford GTP car. The 962 came along as being the first turnkey, and it was a brilliant
and
concept.
genuine turnkey.
Real turnkey race car that anybody could buy and could win with. And everybody who bought one just about won something at some time with it. And so even though Holbert was the guy, he had the team, he had the Derek Bells and the Al Unser Juniors and then the Chip Robinsons. He had the guys to do it, which then ramped up everybody else's deal. And a lot of guys like Aiken and Levin then chose to hire drivers to drive their car, and they assumed this almost greater role of being the elder statesman team owners of the series. So those were the go-to guys, not Hans Stuck or Joe Gartner or Price Cobb or Hurley Haywood. It was Bruce, Preston Henn, brought Wallach and Foyt together and created that whole story. So these guys were innovative, creative, and would drive when they could. Rob Dyson obviously was one of those.
But they also started to realize that these cars were the speed and time has shifted enough to where I'll climb in and I'll race it too. Yeah, these things are now
they're pushing the edge of what I'm capable of doing,
which is phenomenal.
Yeah.
But
and that was part of that growth thing. Was it ended up being not the best place for the privateer to drive in, but the privateer to be an owner.
But coming back to your point on that exactly, we've seen many times in motor racing the driver who says, hey, boy, something's changed here to where I'm really no longer able to drive the car. Yeah. Thanks, it was a fun time, but I'm out. Folks were enjoying themselves so much in IMSA that by and large, all of those drivers stuck around as team owners. That doesn't always, that's a good sign.
Happens, yeah. So I mentioned that earlier that they were having such a good time and they felt that it was administered well enough for them to continue their investment in that way. And they still had a great time, you know. So that ended up by the mid-'80s, basically, when you looked at a grid of a Camel GT race, you saw the best sports car racers in the world coming to the United States to make their living here, every one of them. The only guy I could think of who never did was Jackie Hicks. Okay, but everybody else, Moss, Wallach,
that's a great
Stuck,
point.
Ludwig,
Cyril
Vandermeer. You just go down the list, and they're Redmond.
They all came
here and made their living. And Jim Crawford, Whitney Gantz.
But then we also had the other thing too, which is another testament. Yeah, we'll get IndyCar stars punch in for Daytona these days, maybe see, if they don't have any conflicts. Back then it was not uncommon to have a Bobby Rahal is here, and I mean, and not again,
and Brabham came from IndyCar to come race here, so guys made the switch and went
domestically. It wasn't just if I'm free. It was like, hey, tell me where I can slot in.
You had Rick Knoop, you had Bob Earl, you had Morton, you had EFR, you had Hobbs had been around for a decade already,
He was already old.
Right, whatever. But, you had a lot of guys that Darren Brassfield who were of that caliber, who were products of road racing in North America. Holbert, obviously, Chip Robinson, Super V's. So, there was all these Americans here as well, and they were all on that same level, driving these super badass cars really fast. So, yeah, the spectacle was unbelievable.
I mean, and again, I'm not trying to overstate the obvious, but when you think about a racing series that has the highest caliber international drivers, also some of the lowest caliber, but highest caliber international drivers come in, back then, especially in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, IndyCar was clear number one in terms of motorsport in North America. They all wanted in. I don't know if I will live to see as rich of an era in a single series where anyone you talk to says, yeah, IMSA in the 70s and 80s in particular, even up to the early 90s, kind of the best thing ever. Yeah. And if you get someone who disagrees, you punch them in the face. Or they're an alien. One of the two.
They don't know. They're dead, yeah. So, it was, having lived through it, worked through it, I mean, in the 80s, I became the race director.
Yeah.
Taking Charlie's place in 83, I think, when he had open heart surgery, decided to retire. And, it was kind of seamless, which was pretty, and it's mentioned today that a lot of people thought they would be really big shoes to fill. But when he stepped aside, he and John said, okay, you take over. And, Charlie was there, but he never imposed himself. So I'm in my 20s now.
Wow.
I'm in my 20s, and I'm running these guys for a decade. And by then I was like a VP of competition or something else as well. But titles aside, that was one of the most pleasing things to, run the first Miami Grand Prix races, all the street races we did, the challenges that presented, going to Daytona, going to Sebring, and having that quality of people. And I have to say, it spread down to GTO and GTU as well. It wasn't just the prototypes. The manufacturers were heavily involved there as well, and so they brought in their own shoes to do the same stuff, whether it was Scott Pruett or Brassfield or Irv Hare for Oldsmobile,
Baldwin,
Willie T. Ribbs,
you name it.
Chris Cord, Jack Baldwin. I mean, these guys knew what they were doing. And in GTU, you had the Mazda Brigade, you had the Nissan Brigade, you had the Dennis Aussies, the Porsche guys. So it was just a high-end experience for me to work with these guys and to say, okay, we're having a driver's meeting, and have them all show up and actually listen to what I would tell them, which obviously helped me grow into being a better official, because I used to look at all that and still do today. You don't need to take attendance, because I'm not going there to waste my time, and I don't expect you to waste yours. So if you don't think it's important to hear what I have to say, don't come see me after the race with a problem about what I said.
Brilliant.
You weren't there. All right? So I established that from kind of Charlie, and he goes, yeah, that's the right way to do it. You're not wasting your time. You don't want to waste their time. But you get to the point, you tell them how we're going to do it. No surprise from you, no surprise from me. Let's go. And they went and raced, and it was great. And that carried on to even when I came back to do that again in the 2000s at Grand Am, of being very cut and dry. Guys, I'm not going to take attendance. You don't want to be here? That's your problem. But don't come bother me afterwards about something I brought up in this meeting, because I ain't going to listen to you,
I love it.
And everybody respected that, and they weren't sitting there, looking at their phones in 10 minutes, because they knew that if I was saying something, they should pay attention, and that's the way you have to be. But anyway, so the 80s, the 80s were, you know, you sit back now and you don't realize how cool that really was, but it was really cool. I mean, to work with those people, those teams, with the Gurneys and the Kaz Kasners and the Don Devendorfs and the Peter Schmidts from Porsche, or Bott, or those guys, Flagel, the guys in Germany, the Japanese at Nismo, to work with those people, you know, Damon Barnett at Mazda, Dick Roberts at Nissan in the early days. I mean, they were great motivating people, not only themselves, but they motivated others to accomplish great things. And that was one of the pushes when you said you let it go. We saw that this was going to go somewhere. We also knew there'd be an end point. And when you get to that era in the 90s, the end point would be when the tobacco deal would run out, which we knew when that was, 5 years out. So rather than tip the bus over, we're like, let's run it till it's gone, because it's going to just get more cool. And it did. The numbers went down and there were fewer privateers, but we had Camel Lights, and that's where they all went. And then that became a miniature manufacturer hotbed with Acura and Buick and Chevy and Mazda. And guys that were running GTU cars 10 years earlier were now running prototypes, all right, as the smaller class. And so actually the single most competitive season, I think, was 1991, where everybody involved won at least once.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think that happened at any other season. So, yeah, it went way longer than, you know, the late 80s. It went well into the 90, 91. 93 was kind of the last year where the Toyotas just kind of creamed everybody. But that was about what was left, kind of like today, except there was other people to race against. But all in all, those cars, and just about every successful form of the sport, in my experience, it's got to run 10 years to fulfill its thing, you know, and GTP did that. And it did get to a point, there was an economic downturn in the late 80s that took a couple years to trickle down. So by the early 90s, there was definitely, it wasn't the economic situation it once was. We knew Camel was going away, but you know, the cars by then, the Intrepids, the Toyotas, the Nissan development, the Porsches were still in the game. Everybody was still in the game in some way.
XJR14 showed up,
you know, 3.5 liter cars, you know. So we, again, okay, that's different. It's not what we do. Bring it on, you know. And that was a cool car for sure. No question. So anyway, that's the 80s.
Let's close on this for now. And this is, I think, for those, as I've read, there are a number of people who have learned about IMSA in the 1980s in the past couple of years, by and large from Randy Lanier getting out of prison. Yeah. And the stories of the drug trafficking, race car drivers, I mean, that's always going to sell. That's always so. Despite the mechanical excellence and the engineering innovations and other things, the fact that IMSA, by chance, had Whittington Brothers, John Paul Sr. I've never really lumped Jr. into all that, but that's my take. I know some might, but Randy and whatnot. You're obviously in charge of making the series work. You're in charge working on the technical side, race director side. How folks earn their money. I mean, we more recently with Scott Tucker, for example. There's no police force within IMSA or IndyCar or otherwise to be doing financial checks and whatnot on how people pay for the motor racing that they do. How were you at that time trying to manage a situation that was not secret, but trying to at least make sure there was a separation of church and state? Hey, if you want to do your business, fine. I don't want to see trucks backing up at, you know, whatever Grand Prix here with bales of whatever being offloaded. I'm sure that had to be something you had to manage, even if it wasn't in your job title.
It, you know, from early on, there was always, you know, the wealthy sportsman guys in the game. It's kind of the basis of this. In Europe, it was princes and dukes and counts and stuff, right? So how'd they get their money? Well, they had devious means in those days as well, and before World War II. But So that era with those guys, there were always, questions, and there was always assumptions, but there was always a very steadfast position of, look, as long as it's not being done here under our watch in our area while we're doing an event, it's not our business. We don't know what any of those people do in their other business, any of them, So we wouldn't take the rumor or the assumptions that this guy's doing something wrong. You kind of look at it ironically today that they were basically, importers, smugglers.
Yeah.
It wasn't like they all got high and went and raced 935s. They didn't do that, okay? They had a business or got involved in a business that created a lot of cash, and racing was a great way to get rid of a lot of cash. They also all carried, at one time or another, legitimate sponsorship. I mean, JLP was sponsored by Miller Beer. They managed to keep their separation of church and state intact, even on commercial basis. Blue Thunder was a legitimate Apache powerboats. I mean, it was all related to Don Arno and the boat thing, and who used what to smuggle and who used what to chase the smugglers.
Sure.
And all that sort of stuff. That's a whole other story. But the reality of it is they were there. The Whittingtons, same way. They had Sun Systems. They had a couple of different sponsors over the years when the cars were yellow, besides their purchase of Road Atlanta and using it to market Road Atlanta. And you could all say, well, that was all bogus. It's easy to say now. But at the time, it didn't not make sense that there was some legitimacy because they were paying their bills. They were entering the way they should. They were doing the right thing and acting the correct way within IMSA's realm. There was no basis on which to step out of that. We had a couple other, and it's in the book. There's a whole chapter about those guys because you can't ignore that. But there's some other people. There's a guy named Chris Wilder who started a 7 or 8 woman murder series at the Miami Grand Prix. He's a GTU guy. So we've had a couple other questionable individuals with questionable activities, and obviously I'm sure even today there's still quite a bit of and I'm not singling Scott Tucker out, but the white collar crime or the way people get their money. There were rumors about other people who at times owned IMSA.
Sure.
About how they got their money.
Yes.
And so you sit there and you go, that's not really the organization's job. If you catch somebody doing it on your watch, that's a different story. Then you have to take action. But that never really occurred. That was never that blatant a view of that. So, when guys show up running 935s who also fly P-51s at Reno, they got to have some resources from somewhere. Okay, where it came from, they sell jets. Okay, I buy that. But knowing the details of that, we just didn't go. We didn't go there unless there was something at our table at an event that we had to deal with. We would not do that. It wasn't our role.
Tell us when folks are going to be able to read all the chapters.
Okay. So first, the book is called IMSA 1969 to 89 and How John Bishop Created the World's Greatest Sports Car Racing. It's a long title, but it's deserving of that. Yeah. So it will be released in January at the Rolex 24 RRDC dinner and at a planned exhibit at the Peterson Museum in Los Angeles on the same weekend, which will also air the race 24 hours on big screen TVs in the museum.
Brilliant.
And we'll also have a selection of some of the most important cars by decade of IMSA on display, as well as inviting a lot of the West Coast guys that don't come to Daytona but go to Long Beach for the RRDC stuff. Because a lot of the drivers are still around, and they're eager participants in passing on their stories as well, because they have as many or more as anybody. So the book is it's being published by Octane Press. I mean, I could put a plug in.
Good people.
Lee Clancher, and it's actually, there are some pre-order opportunities on their website right now for a lesser price, but it'll come out in January. It's about 380 pages. It covers John and Peg's early life, getting married, what he did before he went to the SCCA years, the politics of his departure from there, and then the creation of IMSA in 1969. So there's a lead-in chapter that kind of gives you a little bit of feel that, came from Mitch primarily and the family of what they were like as people, and where their background and their roots were, which were very basic and simple. Again, not a car guy, believe it or not, to the creation of IMSA and the circumstances politically in racing at the time that allowed it to be created. And then it just carries on through the 60s, the late 60s, 69 were the first races. Oops. And then, the 70s, and then the decision to get away from open wheel racing and do sedans and GT cars, and then Camel GT, and all the way to 89, which is that we stopped at 89. That's the year John retired, and I actually took his place. And it was also the same time that it was sold as a business for the first time, which changed its nature. And that's probably another conversation for another update.
The first of 37 owners over the next 8 years.
Like that, yeah. So, that's what it's all about. And it's, I think it's a good story. It's a good story about that can-do generation that some of us feel today may be gone. But here's a guy from really simple roots.
But here's a beacon people can read about.
Who really did something amazing. He had help along the way, but it was his decisions and his way of doing things. He was a fantastic guy to work with, and you always had that feeling. He wasn't our boss. He was the leader of our team. And, anybody that talks about him, and there's plenty of quotes from significant people in the sport today who basically give John personal credit for the opportunity that they had to be where they are today. And I think that's an important part of it. The first part of the book is just that. Quotes from people. You'll go down the list of names and go, holy crap.
Yeah.
And it's, it's heartening that, for Mitch and I, it's really heartening that we had the chance to give them their credit. And Peg's just as much a part of it as John was, because without her, he would not have been able to do what they did, and vice versa. And it all started with when they moved to Florida after they retired and Grand Am started in the 2000s. I'd go over to their house in Ocala, and we just would record 3 or 4 hours of conversation about everything that happened. So that was the incentive to put it to paper, was to take those recordings and use that. So there's a lot of personal anecdotes from John from those. There's a lot of quotes and stories from other people involved, drivers, about what it was like to be in IMSA in this time frame. There's obviously a lot of personal stuff from myself and Mitch. So it's a really good, I think it's a really good story. We stayed away, we have to make reference every year of what kind of happened. It does focus on the main show. There's references to Firehawk and RS and Kelly and chapters on some of them. But we had to focus on what the real steam engine was, and it was the Camel GT. So we talk about what kind of happened each year, but then we elaborate on it with these personal insights from that year. So I think even people who've copy edited, who are not racing people, have been really complimentary of how compelling a story it is of that generation and people who could make things happen, even though it happens to be with racing. So that makes me feel pretty good. And Mitch, and it's loaded with photographs. A lot, not all, but most haven't been published before. So there's a lot of unique images in there. So that's kind of cool because it does show not just pictures, a lot of pictures of the cool cars, of course, but there's a lot of pictures of the racetracks. Like in 1978, what did Road America look like? And it's like, holy crap. So it's what I call atmospherics. It captures a lot of what it was kind of like. And it's funny because you would appreciate this. Back then, anybody who shot images at racetracks was shooting them for a press kit in black and white, and they wanted car pictures and headshots. That was it.
Yeah.
So the idea of going to a race and capturing its feel was just not there. So it was really difficult in the early part and even into the 80s section of finding photos from competent people of high enough quality that could capture that feel. So it's all in there. I think if you're into this, you'll want to certainly read it, not just look at the pictures, and that was important to us as well as the story.
I can't. Excuse me. Let me make a little note. I've been making notes of what I need to try and edit out my coughs. By the way, I apologize. cannot wait to get my hands on the book, Mark, and also cannot wait for us to try and find some time to do a part 2 of your life and career, knowing how GTO and GTU taking off in the latter portion of the 80s as well. It's almost like that's a whole separate starting line there. And yeah, I'm sure time.
And you get the World Sports Cars. That was a total IMSA creation. We just sat around one day and said, we need to change this game, and here's what we're going to do. And we just did it.
All the ownership changes and iterations to Grand Am and your, father of the DP. One of, but
and then DPI in the next decade.
So yeah, like
Again,
I said, we've got
of
about 27 parts of your life and career, but hopefully folks have enjoyed part 1, B, know that they have a book to buy, which is going to be awesome here, and as always, brother, thank you for your time.
No pressure. I'd love to do it. It's kind of fun to reminisce with people who also kind of feel the same, and hopefully we install that kind of enthusiasm for the past, because I learned over the years, if you don't remember your past, you're destined to repeat its mistakes, which is a fairly common line, but it's true. So.
And that was Mark Raffauf. Spent a little over an hour in IMSA's business trailer at Monterey, and went a little longer than expected, but whenever Mark and I connect, we tend to stretch the old clock a bit. Again, the guy is just full of so many stories, has genuinely seen it all, heard it all, been through all the wars, and not only has survived to tell, but also continues to work with IMSA. Truly, the guy's been there since almost day one, is still here, still a big part of what IMSA does, was truly vital in crafting this new and now very popular Daytona Prototype International formula. So pretty cool, pretty cool. We don't have that very often. Someone who's just been part of the lifeblood of a single series. It's changed names a little bit. It's been, it's morphed a little bit, but Mark's been there for the whole thing, which makes me truly excited to sit down with him, hopefully at Daytona in January, to capture part 2 of his racing life and career. All right, I'm Marshall Pruett. This is the Marshall Pruett Podcast presented by Cooper Tires. Thank you for listening.